Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar called Water Stewardship in Drought Conditions. My name is Brenna Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of the Lake County Farm Bureau. And together with Deborah Summerfield, President of the Lake County Wine Grape Commission, we'd like to welcome each of you to today's webinar. We've designed today to give you an opportunity to hear from experts and growers about how they look at drought conditions and how to adjust farming practices to balance water conservation, plant health, successful crop production, and overall farm sustainability. Before we get started, I'd just like to review a bit of housekeeping. All attendees have been placed on mute, and during this webinar, the chat function has been disabled. However, if you have a question during the session, you may type it into the Q&A, and I will ask our speakers to address a few of them if time allows at the end. Originally, we had scheduled this webinar to conclude at 2:30. However, we have added some pertinent information we hope you'll find useful and will conclude today at 2:45. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Commission's website following the webinar. So to kick us off, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. We will begin with an update from county officials. Sheriff Brian Martin is here to provide an update on the recent declaration of a state of emergency due to drought conditions. We're also going to have a focused panelist discussion featuring the following speakers. Brock Zoller is president of the Pear Doctor Incorporated and an independent agricultural advisor to pear and wine grape growers. He has been active on many local and industry boards and committees, holds a doctorate in plant pathology from UC Davis, and farms wine grapes, walnuts, and owns a pear orchard. Brian Rahn is a certified professional soil scientist, certified agronomist, and certified crop advisor, and president and founder of Coastal Viticultural Consultants Incorporated, which specializes in vineyard feasibility studies, soil mapping, vineyard nutrition, vineyard design, water conservation, pathogen spore traps, and vineyard irrigation management. Cameron Mortson is managing partner of Thompson Mortson Vineyards and his Lake County operation, L&L Vineyards. He's currently serving on the Lake County Wine Grape Commission and is newly elected to the California Association of Wine Grape Growers. He's also an appointee of the Sonoma County Planning Commission and holds a Master's of Science degree in agriculture with a specialization in crop science. Moderating our panel today is Clay Shannon, owner of Shannon Ridge Family of Wines and Shannon Ranches, which today comprises 900 vineyard acres. His winery was named one of the hottest wine brands by Wine Business Monthly, and today produces 328,000 cases of wine under nearly a dozen brands. We hope you find today's session useful and timely. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sheriff Brian Martin.
Thank you, Brenna. Thank you for all the participants in putting this on. It's a very important discussion. As Brenna talked about, I want to discuss the recently ratified declaration of an emergency due to drought conditions in Lake County. In my role and capacity as the County Emergency Services Director, I issued a proclamation on May 6th declaring drought conditions. Obviously, this proclamation is a little bit different than other emergency proclamations that we have. The drought isn't something that we can really respond to and control, much like with fires, we can put them out. But with the drought, we're really at the mercy of Mother Nature. And the only thing we can do is take steps to conserve water and then implement measures if needed to ensure compliance with our requests. The governor recently ratified a proclamation statewide that includes 41 counties. One of those counties is in Lake County, declaring drought emergencies throughout the vast majority of the state. And earlier last month, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Commissioner declared a disaster in many California counties as well as a result of drought conditions. What the emergency proclamation does is it opens up some avenues of funding, both for county, private organizations that may not typically be available if you're not in a declared state of emergency. Already, we've had some of our municipal water districts report back that they're seeking some funding and that the funding may be contingent on the declaration of an emergency. So we want to make sure that any resources that are available, not only for our governments, but for our private industry sectors that are impacted by this ongoing drought disaster, have every opportunity to be reimbursed for any damages that they've suffered or any losses that are incurred as a result of this. Certainly doesn't guarantee the availability of those fundings, but however, it will make a lot of those fundings available. Our goals at the county right now are mainly we're in an informational and an encouraging mode of operation to try to encourage people to voluntarily implement practices that conserve water, whether it's turning off the water while you're brushing your teeth. It might be something as simple as that. To people in this industry, maybe practice the best watering practices that are available that will still allow you to stay in business. We want to make sure that those water resources, whether they're groundwater, surface water, wells, municipal water sources, don't run dry and cause additional impacts. We're going to have regular discussions with the Board of Supervisors. We're convening a group to discuss what our response is going to be tomorrow with some key stakeholders within county government and some of the other local stakeholders in city and tribal governments, as well as representatives from the Farm Bureau, cannabis industry, water resources, and others. Again, the focus of our efforts is to really get the word out to try to save as much water as we can. And we also want to make sure that we're setting good examples ourselves as we ask others to do the same. With that, I'm happy to take any questions now or throughout the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Martin. And I'll look at the chat and let you know if we have any questions as we move forward. So before we get to our panelist discussion, Brock Zoller is going to give us an update on the county rainfall trends for this year with a bit of a historical perspective as well.
Well, hopefully we can get the rainfall graph on the screen there. If Megan is listening there in the background someplace, hopefully that'll pop up. But years ago, I started working here in about 1972 in Lake County. One of my first clients was Ross Benson. And he had rainfall data dating back to about 1935. And his father had been a farmer back into the previous century here in Lake County. So there was a lot of history there. And as we approached the 1976-77 drought, if you look at your screen there, there was quite a bit of concern expressed in the county. And Ross Benson had been through the one in the 30s, and so he was maybe a little less concerned about it. But as you can see, we hit some pretty tough rainfall years there. 76, 77, and if you progress ahead to where we are today, you can see we're at least that low as far as the Big Valley rainfall. Fortunately, it's a little better in some other areas of Lake County, but basically the same criterion is there. It's one of the lower rainfall years, and some places such as Upper Lake have a little higher rainfall always, so they're a little higher at this point, but only about 4 inches above Big Valley. And normally that's kind of where they are. They're about, they're 20-30% more in the Upper Lake area than Big Valley. And same goes around the county. It kind of depends on where you are. But hopefully we'll have Scott De Leon in here, and we'll have some well tests to show where the groundwater level is in Big Valley in relation to this rainfall. There is some hope if you look at the years leading into 76, 77 that there weren't quite as heavy rainfall, but there were more of them leading into it in a row. If you move over to where we are today, you can see we have some spikes up, but one that was pretty low also, below 20 here. And so we're not exactly sure, how we are coming into this, except our house uses Chelsea Creek water, and the creek got up last year in extremely low water year, where it had not in some other years when it had been a little bit higher. So we have some hope, and part of it, I think, is probably the fires. They've taken a lot of vegetation off the hills, and so that water ends up literally in the streams, which regenerate the groundwater. You've probably heard people that are concerned about groundwater down in the San Joaquin Valley, and the experts say it takes thousands of years when the groundwater gets depleted to regenerate it. Well, that's really not the case here in Lake County, fortunately. We get annual rainfall that goes into the streams, and it annually recharges the groundwater in Big Valley. So rainfall is very important, and as I say, there may have been more recharge occurring this year, and I hope to get some information from Scott about his well test to show that that's true. But when we went into 76, 77, one of the differences I recall was that a lot of the pear trees came out, and there wasn't much growth on them there in 77 especially, and they had a huge crop, and I had trouble sizing it. This year I see a big crop, but I see a lot of growth on the trees. They're growing like weeds. So part of this has to do with, frankly, we led into this winter year after we saw that 3 out of 4 of the best rainfall months were bad. We started doing some irrigating in March. So to the extent we're able, I think that helped quite a bit. The vineyards are a little bit different in that in Big Valley here, we oftentimes will have to put on frost water leading into the season, and that will pretty much recharge the groundwater if we're putting on normal amounts of frost water, and we don't have to worry quite so much about how the roots are being wetted. This year there wasn't quite so much frost, so that's another consideration. Maybe we haven't quite gotten as wet as much as we thought. But when you get down to about 8.5 inches of rainfall like we have in Big Valley, you can expect maybe to get 6 feet of soil wet, and then there's going to be dryness. So the question is, where does that leave us for the rest of the season? How should we begin to water based on the fact that the lower part of the profile is probably going to be drier than normal? So that's kind of my lead in. If Scott has got here, I'd love to hear some well figure data.
Thank you, Brock. We don't have Scott in yet, so right now I'm going to turn it over to Brian Ron, who's going to give us just some introductory info before we get into our panel discussion.
Okay, all right. So this is all about drought. So first thing, spend water like money, because that's how critically we should be thinking about it, even when there isn't a drought. Is conserving water resources every way we can. So we got a number of questions we want to answer. When do we start? And I want to kind of talk about questions we have and maybe some sources of information or data that you can use to kind of help make those decisions. So when do we start? Or do I pre-irrigate? Well, that's soil moisture driven. So you need to know the soil moisture status of your root zone, at least the top, say 4, 5, 6 feet, depending on how deep your soil is. Number of ways to do that. There are soil moisture probes that can measure soil moisture. You can use a hand soil auger down in there and evaluate the soil moisture by hand. So if you feel that starting out the soil moisture is low in what I would call your critical root zone, where most of your roots are, then you would consider a pre-irrigation to wet that area. And even with pre-irrigations, you're not going to irrigate the entire row. You're just going to make that onion. You're going to put some water there underneath that emitter to provide some water for the plants to start. Now, during the growing season, so when do we start? Pre-irrigation is soil. When do we start irrigating the vineyard? Well, that's plant measurements. And there's tools you can use there. There's, pressure bomb, parameters. There's also things like a stress index chart. And I think I sent that on, the one that we use, where you look at just, the tips, how fast the plants are growing. And as they start to slow down, as the shoot lengths start to shrink, that's a sign that they're undergoing some water stress. And then you would start to consider putting on some irrigations. So now that okay, great. I've looked at them, I've figured it out. They need to put on water. Now, how much do I put on? Well, typically that's evapotranspiration driven, and it depends on how big your canopy is, what the evapotranspiration forecast is going to be. And I guess everyone can get Western weather for your network here up in Lake County to be able to access good weather data to help you look at the ET forecast and use that as a guide for how much water you want to put on. Then the final thought of, okay, now I'm ready to start. I'm going to put on X amount of water per vine. The next thing you want to consider is making sure you're placing it properly. What I mean by that is you want to look at the efficiency of your system. Leaks, plugged emitters, and there's some high iron waters out here that make it difficult to get good distribution uniformity. Good distribution uniformity becomes more and more important as water resources get tighter, that you're putting on a more precise amount for all the vines or all the trees that you're irrigating. So the distribution uniformity is one thing. The other thing would be making sure you're not driving the water that you're putting on 24 gallons, to just pick, or 18 gallons or 12 gallons. You want to make sure that you're not pushing that water deeper than where your critical root zone is. So maybe you're going to need to run, if you run 12 hours, maybe you're going to need to run 2 6s to avoid 2 6-hour sets to avoid pushing the water too deep. And that is another function of measuring soil moisture, to where the plant stress will tell you, and the ET forecast will tell you how much you need. But the soil moisture helps in knowing that number one, the soil moisture got there and how deep it went. If you have a lot of water going deep, or your deep profile is staying wet, chances are you may be putting on too much water, or not, or you can split it up and maybe apply less water. So our objectives: number one, grow enough canopy to ripen a crop first. So that's what the pre-irrigation is about, making sure that you can get shoot elongation to grow enough leaves to ripen your crop. Next thing we want to do is set a crop when they get into bloom. Any water stress at bloom, and part of the crop is gonna shatter. Severe water stress at bloom, it's gonna be a huge problem with shatter. So making sure that going into set, that you've got the plants at least with some water in that upper profile where they can grow normally and have enough leaves. Now we've got the crop set and you're into sizing. Our objective is to keep enough leaves on the plant to ripen the crop. And this is where we have some leeway, where we can, the way I describe it is you hold your water until you see the whites of their eyes. In other words, you hold your water until you feel, especially, and there's two classes here now. People that have plenty of irrigation water, plenty of water resources, well, you're just going to end up irrigating more. The folks that have limited water resources, this is where you're going to have to keep your powder dry as long as you can. And the events I would look for would be what they call high VPD events, vapor pressure deficit. And that number is in the Western Weather portal where you can look at that. Those are the events where, with high VPD events, you run the risk of yellowing canopies, dehydrating fruit, and those are the events where you need to put on maybe the little extra water that you've got to get them through that real high heat, and then have them just kind of limp along after that. So look at soil moisture, access to weather data that's free, correct? Is that correct? That we have free weather? Yeah, you get nods there. Yes, from the Grape Growers Association. So learn how to access that. Use your eyeballs to go out there and measure if you need to, and see if they're still growing and what they look like. And then try to use the water as effectively as you can. And what I found, particularly in what we call skeletal soils, rocky soils, is if you split it up, rather than giving them 12 hours at once, but you give them 4 gallons 3 times that week. I know it's a pain in the butt, and I know it's easier with timers, but the water goes further. So that's all I've got. I think I've said enough.
Thank you so much, Brian. And now I'm going to turn it over to Clay, who's going to lead a panelist discussion with Brock, Brian, and Cameron to discuss some of these management practices further.
Good afternoon, and thanks to all the panelists for your good speeches so far. And we came up with a list of questions to ask you folks, and I'm going to jump around. I'm not going to start on top so I can confuse you a little bit, and then I might add some different things. And but let's start here. And anybody can jump in there, whoever's first gets to answer the question, but what broad suggestions do you have for irrigation this growing season? And this needs to cover the valley floor versus mountains, versus if you have a lot of water versus not much water at all. What are the key strategies that we all could do a better job with or learn from?
I'll jump in here, Clay. Yeah, so I think you heard Brian mention distribution uniformity, and I think another key component to distribution uniformity is if you only have a certain amount of water to use this year, is you want to make sure you're applying it as evenly as possible, because I think one of the things that's going to become critically more important on years like this is trying to get the crop to ripen evenly. So we all know that winemakers can be efficient or can be picky, and so they're going to wait for kind of those straggling vines to catch up to everything. So whatever we can do to kind of keep that water distribution uniformity as as high as possible. That's going to help, because another thing that Brian mentioned was, if you have rocky soils, is you want to break up those irrigations a little bit more. And so obviously you have to know your site and know what's going to be best for your vineyard there. But the further off your distribution uniformity is, the worse that variability is going to be. So I think that's going to be one of the most important things. Whether you're in the hillsides, right, it's harder to have distribution uniformity because the drip emitters are running downhill. So just knowing your site and knowing what's going to be most practical for your site and your soils.
Thanks. Lots of questions here, so I'm going to keep going here. What specific tools are critical to crop management during drought?
Well, I could chip in here, and then probably Brian would have a lot to say about this, but I think it's very important to have an idea of what your soil looks like. And the best way I've found out over the years to know that is to plant your crop into something that's already had a perennial crop plant and gone through crop cycles and problems. And you get to see how those perennial crops respond in particular years. And that situation is a product that's down there in the soil. And it's not really going to go away unless you attempt to change it somewhat. So most important thing really tool you can have really is to know what your soil structure is. If you don't have perennial crops to look at before you plant, you can dig a lot of holes in the backhoe and find out the layering of the soil. In some places that really shouldn't be planted until you do some restructuring, break up the layers so that the water penetration is the same across all of them. I think these droughts are a learning process, and we're basically going to find out where those places are in particular vineyards and perennial crops because we're going through a situation we haven't gone through before. So, for example, if you're out in the valley floor and, our soils up here have been formed by streams meandering around in the valley, and there can be layers there of gravel that you don't even know exist unless you dig holes or unless you saw perennial crop growing them, and they sort of, faded away at the end of summer, indicating that there was something wrong there in the soil. So those are situations that really you don't see sometimes. If there's plenty of water that comes down, from above and it fills all the soil crop pile, you don't really see those things develop every year the same way. So it's important to keep in mind that these things can vary a little bit each year.
Thank you. This is a directed question, Cameron. How are you going to approach grapevine shoot thinning this year and Sauvignon Blanc versus Cabernet in where you farm? Any differently?
Yeah, no, I think, one of the things we've noticed in all of our vineyards, and again, it depends on what part of the vineyard is, the vines are already responding to the drought. And so, they're going to tell you what they can and can't do. So in some instances where we thought, we did a pretty darn good job of, pruning to balance, the vines didn't push in some areas, and that could be due to cold damage, or it could be due to drought conditions, because we didn't have adequate rain in the fall. We didn't have adequate rain in the spring. So I think, case in point there is, we were doing some pre-irrigating. We want to make sure that as we're going into bloom that we've got the soil moisture that we need to be able to get the fruit on the vine. And I think, you have to get it on there in order to be able to take it off, because if you can't get the fruit on the vine, it doesn't do you any good. And we're all in this business to raise a crop and make a few bucks. So I think, as soon as we know what these vines can sustain after fruit set, then we're going to go in and just try and attack these things so that we can grow and ripen a nice even crop this year.
Thank you. Do you think, does anybody, this is up for everybody, if we were to limit the Lake County Sheriff Department in their bottled water provisions, would that help our agriculturists? I'm just kidding. Brian, I couldn't help myself there. Sorry.
No pun intended, but I feel way out of my element.
All right, we gotta have a little fun here. There's enough stress around. How do we irrigate a newly planted vineyard this year? I mean, maybe you wish you wouldn't have planted it at this point, but anybody have any ideas on that?
All right, Cameron, you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, I think this is really important. One of the things I'm sure, many people have experienced this in Lake County over the last few years is we're seeing more and more erratic conditions. So earlier frosts, later frosts. So I think, one of the most important things to think about and consider when dealing with non-bearing vines is making sure that you're going to achieve cold hardiness, right? Because grapevines are pretty darn resilient, right? You get them to grow, but if you're irrigating them too far into the fall and you've got soft tissues on there, you're going to be more liable to fall frost. And that, when those vines don't, when they're, the caliper on them is very thin and they don't have a lot of bark to protect them against the cold, is you want to make sure that you get really good lignification going into the fall so that those vines can adequately achieve cold hardiness and make it through the winter. So I think that's an extremely important point on non-bearing vines. It's less of an issue on bearing vines because the fruit will help self-regulate those vines, but certainly on non-bearing vines is just be careful about that late summer irrigation and tapering that down so that those vines can lignify and achieve cold hardiness.
Okay. I'd like to kind of you're talking newly planted vines, vineyards, something you just put in the ground. Okay, this is what I want you to think about. All you people got them in the ground. You just put them in the ground and they've got this little bitty root zone. And then you've gone out there and you've got a plastic jug, a 1 gallon jug of water, and you go glug, 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 glug. You drop that thing there on Monday, you put 1 gallon on. If that was a potted plant, how long do you think that would last? Probably quite a while. So if you're putting on your newly planted vines, you're going to put on, if you putting on an hour and you got a half or 2 liter per hour emitters, so that's about half a gallon. If you're putting on a couple gallons a week or a couple hours, that's about a gallon that's going on top of that vine. So even if you're doing that twice a week, that's plenty of water, depending on how dry that soil is underneath. You're probably going to run some pretty good water to wet that area up first, but then you might want to edge it back a little bit. Young vines have such a limited root zone that you don't really need to be pushing water down 2 and 3 feet initially if you wet it up, because they will get there because the soil's already wet. So even though it's hot or it's going to be 100 degrees or what have you, a gallon or 2 per week is going to be plenty for those little things, as long as you get that onion wetted up.
Okay, I've seen just one comment and then another question. In general, in this county, I don't think we're as bad off as some folks. There's some parts of Napa that I know of. There's people that have zero water. They are dry farming this year for the first time ever. Last year they had water, so it could always be worse, and we hope for the best. But another question: what canopy management techniques could we employ as a grower? You employ to reduce irrigation needs? Brian?
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. Here we go. So, all right. More vertical, less water. More horizontal, more water. The more shade cover you have, the more water you use. But these have their issues too. But the more vertical systems, because you're more prone to burn. So the answer is this: the bigger the vines are, the more you got to feed them. You got a Shetland pony, you got a Clydesdale. Clydesdale is going to drink more water. So to try to limit the growth as best you can, and I would say avoid overleafing. I think the fear of powdery mildew causes a lot of people to basically overleaf and make themselves prone to sunburn. So I think even if you're removing laterals and leaving those fan leaves on the outside, I think that's a good thing to do. The longer the shoots get, the more water you use. If you're going to go in and hedge, that's one way to do it. But if you do that, you've got to remember that if you hedge them after they stop growing, they will not push any more young leaves. So if you're going to hedge them to make the shoots shorter, then you've got to have some active growth, so some of those laterals will push and you'll get some good young leaves to ripen your crop. So as far as canopy management, yeah, that's part of what I'd look at.
Brian, this isn't on our question list, but I've heard some folks that have zero water are shoot thinning down to 1 shoot per spur if it's spur prune, 1 shoot per spur, and then managing the length of that shoot versus your 2 shoots per spur, you might say. What will that have a positive or effect on less water usage?
Absolutely. reduce the number of leaves, you reduce the transpiration, you reduce the number of shoots, you reduce the crop. Reducing the crop doesn't necessarily you save that much water. Yeah, you make a smaller vine, it's going to use less water. And sucker early. Get those suckers out of here. Get the suckers out of the way, and then I guess we'll probably talk about cover crops at some point. How we manage those. But yeah, sucker early, and if you're gonna, if it's cane, you're gonna have shorter canes, aggressively shoot then. Yeah, it'll definitely reduce water.
What positive or negative effect cover cropping and mowing versus cultivation? What are we doing? What's the best for water conservation? What's the best for fire control? What's the best for sequestering carbon, etc.? Anybody want to grab that one?
A best? Okay, it's give and take. So I'm a soil scientist. Soil health is in now. That makes my heart glad. We're thinking about it. If you increase organic matter in your soil, you increase water holding capacity. So the rain that you do get, you're going to hold more of it. So and this game is all about water holding capacity, because we farm soil units. We farm this soil series here, we farm that soil series there, and they aren't always rectangles or squares like we make them. Our fields are the shapes of our soil series. So managing each soil series to increase organic matter, which you do with cover crops, is a great thing. It's good for soil health. It's good for a lot of things. But cover crops are planted weeds, and they dry that soil surface, and they compete with our vineyards. A mistake that I think people have made in the past is putting in rootstocks that weren't vigorous enough. That basically they're putting in these lower, bigger rootstocks that are drought sensitive, and the cover crops would dominate them. We're going to have to learn to live with maybe wall-to-wall cover crop. Who knows? And to try and plant our vineyards to be able to have our soils not requiring tilling. Tilling's great for weed control, and spading looks beautiful, but it oxidizes organic matter. There's no doubt about it. The soils will reflocculate, the structure will come back, but you've got to account for the water use of that cover crop, the nutrient pull of that cover crop, and when people go to cover crops having not used them, I'll give you 2 to 3 years. If you don't change something with your irrigation and fertilization, that vineyard will be weaker. Nothing happens quickly in vineyards, but that will occur. So I'm just saying some of the planning that we do now is going to be for higher, bigger rootstocks, drought tolerant rootstocks, and planning to have our cover crops out there and maybe just mow and find a system where we can get enough vigor out of the grapevines and still have soil health and that extra organic matter to hold more water holding capacity.
I mean, if you're we're talking grapes, and I don't know who's going to answer this, but you have a fungicide program, a preventative program for mildew. We have wettable micronized sulfurs. We have sulfur dusts. We have oils. We have these other whole list of stuff that you use that I don't know what you call them, but strobies and this and that. Does the use of sulfur is pretty inexpensive? Contact is usually pretty good. It works very well. It's a natural product, I guess, or whatever. But what effect, positive or negative, sulfur dust versus a wettable sulfur versus another spray, as far as creating hotter temperature, water usage in vines? Is there anything written or any data to that?
I don't know anything written, but we've used a lot of sulfur, of course, over the years in grapes. And as far as pest management, I personally prefer the oils at this point. But the oils, the same thing. You don't want to use it too late in the year when it's really hot, because maybe you're really going to burn. Same could be said about the sulfur. So there are some issues with those things, and I think they're probably primarily issues in giving the real heat of things rather than this time of the year. Part of the color of sulfur, it could be that if that's light, maybe it would be helpful. That little bit of light colored material on the plants. I don't know. Getting back to what Brian was talking about, the cultivating, I look back over my years of pears, and when we got into tough years, cultivation was where it was at, and it's, in some cases it was just a 1 year thing, but there always was a response from the plants, the cultivating. The question is now, can I legally cultivate? If I'm on a hillside and create sediment, things like that. So those are questions that have to be answered. And some of the people I used to work for, they were very much advocates of transitioning from time to time. They were cover crop people, and it was easy to manage plantings, when you have a cover crop plant equipment on, and they like that. But at some point, you get into a dry year, and I sure don't want to have to support that cover crop because I don't know what my well is going to look like from the end. And we're talking about as if we know what's going to be like at the end of this year. But having gone through years like this before, you don't know. You don't know if you can save the water in your well, or if you elect to pump it out later, maybe it's all going to go out somebody else's well in the same water table. So you're not exactly sure unless you have a lot of experience with your own situation what it's going to be like. So I don't know. I kind of think we have to, manage as best we know our own vineyards at a given time. And I've been through years when wells, for my walnuts where I live out on Kelsey Creek Drive have gone dry, and the creek has gone dry, and it's just really tough. Whereas down in the valley where the wells, have been generated by the streams and they hold up quite well, it hasn't been a problem. At the same time, in some of the drought years, some of the wells have not passed it in the valley. So we don't really know for sure what it's going to be like. That's the problem.
What does going out in the afternoon and feeling the temperature of the leaves? Brian and I are old guys. Brock, you got a nice head of hair still, so I'm going to stick with the old guys on this one. What is feeling the leaves going to do for us here? That's an old thing I used to do, and what's it going to help us with? Somebody.
Leaf temperatures, yes. Okay, are they transpiring? That's the answer. So and so here's the thing: when the stress index thing, at some point we'll put that on website or something or whatever. This is the signal. Vines are climbers. Climb up the canopy. That's what they do. They get up on top. They get up on top of the trees, and there you go. When they start to look like this, the tips have fallen back. Number 3 there. I guess you can't see my cursor. Number 3 there. Here's how vines react to water stress. They close the stomates. Their stomates are little cells that they exchange water with on the leaves in the sun, and they transpire in the shade. So if they're under moderate water stress, the ones in the sun should feel warm to the touch, and your hands are very good sensors. If you have the name people out there with children, if someone has a child, oh yeah, let me feel your forehead, and oh, you have a temperature of 100, gee, you feel hot. Well, 98.6 to 100 is what, 1.6 degrees? These are great sensors for variation in temperature. That's why us out there feeling the canopies work. If you're feeling the sun leaves and they feel warm, but you get those shade leaves and they still feel cool to the touch, you've got them under what we call a stress index of 3, which is a good place to be. If you see yellowing, that's at number 4 here, yellowing underneath, or 4 shows that burned off tip. And then in the heat of the day, even the sun leaves feel warm. You're on the verge of having defoliation problems, and or the bunches feel rubbery, just rubbery in the heat of the day, but in the morning they're not turgid again. You're on the verge of desiccation. So that's what that does. And I one other soil thing, and I'll stop talking. One of the inefficiencies I see is having irrigation systems go through 2 different soil types, a rocky area versus a deep soil, what have you, and you're either over irrigating that rock pile or trying to keep the rock pile going while you over irrigate the rest of your vineyard. Separate those soil units as best you can with your drip systems. That's something I forgot to say earlier. Even if you've got to retrofit some things with second poly or whatever you have to do to where you can get those corners, give them what they need, and stop over irrigating the rest of
I just want to know, in Napa, where I know you're from, the difference between 100 and 98.6 is 1.6 is what you stated. But in Lake County, it's actually 1.4, Brian.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
Oh, nope. Thank you. I stand correct. So my hands are even better than I thought. My math brain isn't working too good this afternoon, but all right, I'll take that.
I think we got one more question, and then somebody's going to cut us off. But I think the biggest question, most of the varietals that are planted in the county, it's either the majority are either Cabernet or Sauvignon Blanc. Is there a way, is there differences in water needs based on valley or hillside, just the varietal? Is there a way we could treat the varietal different, the different varieties different, and water? I'd like to know what you think about that. Am I making sense?
More than I did, I guess.
Cameron, can you irrigate Sauvignon Blanc different than Cabernet?
Yeah, I mean, I think variety is less important than the site. So, if you're up at 2,000 feet in the Red Hills, you're going to be obviously higher elevation. But one of the things that you're going to see later in the fall is you're going to have lower relative humidity, and you're going to have smaller diurnal temperature fluctuations. Whereas if you're down in Big Valley, you're going to see higher diurnal temperature fluctuations, and you're going to see higher relative humidity. And so I think that's a more important cue than variety, Clay, in my mind. So I think just knowing your site and knowing kind of what you're up against is more important than the variety that you've got planted. So those are the things that I'd be thinking about is, hey, what's my elevation? What's my diurnal temperature fluctuation? Changes in relative humidity, because the vines are recovering at night. But if it's not cooling off at night and you're not getting that pickup in moisture at night, then you're kind of finding an uphill battle.
I got one last quick question for Brian, if I can, Brenna. Brian, we're worried about fire and all that. What are you hearing out there? What should we be doing to be smarter about fire prevention and such in the vineyards and keeping our county cooler and less on fire?
That's a great question. People are
wrong Brian.
I was wondering which Brian you were talking about.
Sorry, Brian Martin. The question's for Brian Martin.
I have no idea. I'm a grape guy.
Hey, well, actually, the vineyards have been shown really to stop those fires. So every time I see a vineyard going in, particularly those ones along the Rivieras, those are just huge fire breaks for us. So, putting those vineyards in strategic locations, if you can find a location that's good for the grape grower that happens to provide a benefit for some of our communities that are in precarious situations, that'd be great. As far as personal steps, all those fire mitigation measures, you do having your defensible space, getting rid of the ladder fuels, little things at home like cleaning out your rain gutters. One of the things I don't hear them talking about a lot, and I don't know if this is just anecdotal, but from what I saw during the Valley Fire, those roof vents that everybody has to allow air circulation in the roofs, the ones that had no screens or had plastic screens, it seems that they were able to suck in embers, and those really small, great metal screens that go over those roof vents. I saw a lot of homes that made it through that had those. That was kind of one of the common things. I don't know how much there is to it. That was just my personal observation. But definitely have a plan, be ready to go. I tell people that for fire preparedness, if your plan is, oh my gosh, I'm going to call 911 and figure out what I should do as soon as the fire starts, and your plan's probably going to fail you. So really be prepared for fire season. We've already had some fires that have started. We had one off of Morgan Valley Road last week that was in one of the previous, I think it was in the Rocky Fire burn scar, and it still moved. It wasn't real fast. It wasn't like any of the previous fires where it was just zooming right through here, but it was still able to move through that area that got burned 5 or 6 years ago. So don't make the mistake of thinking that 60% of the land in Lake County is burned, so that's 60%. That's not going to burn. It can burn again, and it'll burn with the same characteristics, maybe a little bit slower, but the same. We'll see the same burn patterns and the same activity as far as it spreads. So be ready. If you got impacted before, there's a likelihood that you could be impacted again.
I should probably comment on that. And I was in the wine to get permission. I did damage reports on probably about 11 different properties that have burned. And really, basically, the vineyards do not burn. They burn around the edges where weeds go up to them and brush and things like that. But as far as going through the vineyard, unless you have cover crops and weeds yourself, they're not really going to burn. So the only ones that had damage, really, per se, were ones that had cover crops, and they were ones that where the cover crop was allowed to grow a little bit too high, where they have to live longer. But other than that, the vineyards, they don't burn. They're green.
I mean, one thing I can say about the cover crops is one thing we do is if you're out there mowing, mow it when the humidity's high. Get the guys up early, shut them down by 11 o'clock in the morning or noon latest or earlier. Watch that humidity. It's a big difference. And let's not make as growers. Let's share with each other and our neighbors. Whether you're mowing weeds or whatever, talk to your neighbors, talk to each other. Let's not make more work for Brian because he does a great job out there. The sheriff, Brian, the sheriff, that is, and mow those weeds when the humidity's high. That's what we do, and I think that's super smart. And that's all I got to say. Do we got to do any questions, or what are we doing?
Well, we had a few questions in the chat. I think we can, given that this is a short question, the only one that hasn't been answered, I think it'll be easy to answer. One of the questions was, if the grower has overhead and drip, is it better to fill the soil profile with overhead or with the drip irrigation?
I'm going to grab that one.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sprinklers that do a better job of putting water everywhere, but use a lot more water. And if you've got a cover crop out there, if you're pre-irrigating with that, the cover crop's gonna use a lot of that water. So if you have a limited amount of water to pre-irrigate with, I would not use the sprinklers. If it was clean disc and you had a lot of water that you could pre-irrigate with, or you could irrigate with but you could do it that way, but the efficiency is so much less because of evaporation. I just think that the best way to deal with it is through the drip system.
Thank you, Brian. Well, on that note, and given that we're a few minutes over, I just really want to thank everyone for their time today and coming and presenting on this topic. Both fire and drought and a little bit of fire. We're heading into a multi-layered, challenging year. So thank you everyone for attending. I want to thank the Lake County Wine Grape Commission for doing all the heavy lifting and putting this webinar together. And of course, to all our speakers, our panelists, and our sheriff for being here and being engaged on the issue. Thank you guys so much, and good luck as we move into early summer here.